Welcome to part 26 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll take the tile maps we created in Tiled and load the JSON data into our Phaser game. We'll go over how to parse the data, extract important level details, and get everything ready for use in our game. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's jump in and bring our tiled maps into Phaser. Next for our level, we will work on parsing our JSON data from Tiled and using this in Phaser. To work with this data, Phaser has a built-in object called a tile map, and this is a container that allows us to parse the tile JSON, CSV, or 2D array of data, and it's going to give us a bunch of utility methods for working with our various tile sets and tile maps to do things like create our collision layers, create our objects from our layers, and much more. This built-in object makes it very easy to work with this data. So to start loading in our data, let's go over to our game scene, and we're going to go to our create level method. After we create our background or foreground, we want to create this new tile map object. Let's make a new variable. We'll call this map. We're going to set equal to this. We'll do make, and now we want to do tile map. Now to create our tile map, we need to provide our configuration, and this is just going to be the key of our asset that we previously loaded. So for our asset name, let's copy our string here. We'll paste that in. Now instead of doing foreground, we want to do underscore level. And so now this asset key, this is going to refer to our JSON file that's associated with our current level. For our dungeon, it'll be our dungeon JSON file. So after we have our tile map, let's just do a console log and we'll take a look at it in our console. So when our scene refreshes, we'll see our new tile map object. This object has all of our tiled level data. So we'll see key things like how big our tile size is, like our tile width and height, how many tiles are our width and height of the level, our overall pixel size. And then we'll see key things like our layers and our object layers, which are what we will need to parse in order to add these objects to our game. So as we start parsing our various layers and creating objects for our scene from our layer data in Tiled, we'll need a location to store all of this data. So when we set up our level in Tiled, we stored everything by a room. As an example, when we add a chest to our room, that chest will have a unique ID for that room ID. We also, when we created things like our doors, we associate that door with a room and which door it'll transition to in the next room. So in order to look up and keep track of all of our objects by our room, we'll want to group them by their room ID. So to add a property to keep track of all this, let's come to the top of our scene, and we'll make a property. We're going to call this objects by room ID. And now for this object, our key is going to be our room ID. And so our key will be of type number. And now this will be an object. And now this object's going to have properties for all the various objects we need to create. And so for our first two properties, we're going to add two maps to keep track of our chests and our doors so we can look them up by their ID. So we'll do chest map. This will be another object. Our key here will also be a number. And then for our type, this will be a chest. Let's copy this line here. We're going to paste this and we'll call this door map. Now for our type, we don't have this defined yet. And so we're just going to call this unknown. Now we'll want to create a few arrays to keep track of all of our game objects. And so we'll have doors. This will be an unknown array. We'll have our switches and our pots. So we'll do unknown. Now for our pots, we'll type that to our pot class. We'll have an array of those. Same thing for our chest. For our next property, we're going to call this enemy group. And this is going to be a phaser group to keep track of all of our enemies in a particular room. So we'll do our phaser. Let's do our game objects. And then we'll do group. Finally, we'll add in room, and this will be our tiled room object. So this tiled room object is just going to refer to our custom class in Tiled we created for our rooms. So on that custom class, we'll just have our key properties like our X and Y, the width and our height of our room, and then finally our ID of our room, so it'll be unique for each object. So now that we have our new property in our class, we can start parsing our JSON data and populating this object. So let's come back down to our create level method. We'll get rid of our console log. First, let's initialize our object. So we'll do this. We'll do our objects by room ID. We'll set it equal to our empty object. So now to create our rooms, we'll make a new method to have this logic. So let's do this. We're going to call this create rooms. And for this method, we're going to pass in two arguments. First will be our tile map, and next will be our layers that we want to parse. So we're going to do our tiled, we'll do our layer names, and we want to do rooms. Let's define that new method. So we'll come down to the bottom of our class. We'll do create rooms. So for our two arguments, we'll have map. This will be our phaser, our tile maps, and then our tile map. Then we'll have our layer name, and we'll have this be a string. We'll do void for our return type. All right, so now to create our room objects, we need to parse our tiled object, and we want to look for an object layer that has a particular name. So on our object, we have this objects array here, and we want to find our object layer where our name is set to rooms. And so that'll be our layer name we provided here. To do this, we're going to use some of those utility functions that we added to our project. So let's do const, we're going to do valid tiled objects. We're going to set this equal to get tiled room objects from map. For this function, we need to pass in our map, and then we want to pass in our layer name. And now we're going to do a console log, and let's do our valid tiled objects. And then let's also log out our tile map. So we'll do console.log, and we'll do our map. So then when our browser refreshes, we're going to have a new array of 6 objects. These 6 objects refer to our 6 tiled room objects that we created in our tile map data. And so where this data is coming from, if we open up our tile map, if we go into our objects, and if we go into our layer, where our layer name is called rooms, we'll see we have this objects property here that has 6 objects on it. Now these objects have all of our metadata from our JSON file, and so we just parse this to pull out the properties that we care about, and that's how we created these rooms here. So we'll have things like our width and our height, our X and Y, but then we also have this ID. And this ID is coming from this properties array here. So those custom properties we added for each of our objects, we're parsing that and then adding that to our object here. That way we only have the fields we care about. And so if we go into our tiled room objects from map function, so our get tiled objects from layer, this goes through our objects array here and it finds our object layer that has the name we provided, which was rooms, and then it grabs all of the objects from that layer and it just makes sure we have those base properties that we need. If for some reason these are not defined, then we won't return that object. Once we have those base objects, we just iterate through them and create our representation of the object we're trying to parse. And in this case, this is going to be our room. And so for our room, we just want those base properties and then our ID that we parse from our data. So back in our game scene, we'll clean up our console logs. So now for our array, we just want to iterate through our array, and we're going to use that data to populate our objects by room ID object. So let's take our valid tiled objects. We'll call the for each method to iterate through our array. Then we'll have our tiled object. And now for each tiled object, we'll do this. We'll do our objects by room ID. We'll reference our tiled object. We're going to use the ID property to create a new property on our object, and we'll set equal to our object. And so now for our object, we just need to add our various properties and initialize them to their default values. So we'll have switches. This will be our empty array. Let's copy this. We'll paste it. And so after switches, we'll have our pots. We'll have our doors. We'll have our chest. And now we'll have our room. For our room, we're going to set that to our tiled object. Now we'll have our chest map and our door map. Now these will be objects. Now if we save, let's come back up to our create level method. After we create our room, let's log out our new property. And so we'll do console.log, and we'll do this. We'll do our objects by room ID. So now our scene refreshes. We'll have our new object with our 6 rooms, and we've initialized it with our initial properties. Now that we've parsed our tile data to find all of our custom room objects, we need to do the same thing for our other object types. So as an example, our pots, our doors, our enemies, our chest, and different things like that. To find that data on our tile map, we need to go through our objects layer. And on our objects layer, we need to find all of our layers that end with a particular name. As an example, if I want to create all the enemies for my various rooms, I want to find all of my layer names where we end with /enemies. So we need to parse this room/6/enemies layer. We'd also want to parse this room/4 enemies layer in order to create all those objects of that given type. And so to get started, first we're going to parse through our object layer, and we're going to find all of our layers for our objects where we have our rooms/room ID pattern. To do this, let's make a new variable, do const. We'll do rooms. We're going to set that equal to get all layer names with a prefix. So we'll provide our tile map, and then we'll do our tile layer names, and we want to do rooms. What this function will do is we can provide that prefix, and now we're going to go through our object layer names, and we're going to filter them to have just that prefix. We'll then split out our data, so then that way we make sure it's in our pattern of our rooms. So it's going to be rooms / our ID, then / whatever object we're creating. And so by splitting by our / here, we'll make sure we're grabbing our correct layers. So now if we come back to our game scene, now that we have our array of our various layers, we want to iterate through them. And so we'll do map. And so now we're going to have our layer name, and this will be a string. We're going to return a new object, and this object is going to have just our name. So we'll refer to our layer name, and then we'll have our room ID. And to get our room ID, we're going to do parse int. We need to use our layer name. We want to split it by our slash. And now we want to grab the second element in our array, which will be our room ID. And now let's log out our rooms, so we'll make sure our logic's working. So now in our console, we should see an array of 20 objects, and these are going to be our various layer names that have rooms in it with their appropriate room IDs. Now that we have our array of layer names that we need to parse, for each of our layers, we can follow the pattern of what we did for create rooms, where we take a given layer name and then we can parse our objects from our tile data. So to do this, we'll make a method for each of our object types. Let's copy our method here for create rooms. In our method, we're going to call this create doors. And we'll add in one additional argument. So besides our map, our layer name, we're also going to pass in our room ID that we're currently processing. And so we'll use our room ID for populating our objects by room ID object here. For the time being, I'm just going to do a console.log. We're going to do our layer name and then our room ID. And now we'll do this for all of our other object types. So let's copy this. We'll paste it a few times. So after create doors, we'll have create buttons. These will be our switches from our JSON data. Now we'll have create pots. We'll have create chests. And now we'll have create enemies. And we get rid of this last method here. Now back up on our create level, we can call our various methods. So now for each of our layers, we want to filter these layers to only have our layer names that end with our particular object type. So let's get over our console log here. Make a new variable, do const. We'll call this switch layer names. We'll set that equal to our rooms. We want to filter, and we're going to filter our array by the layer. And so we'll do our layer.name. We'll do ends with, and so it's going to be our slash. And now we can reference our tiled layer names, and we want to do switches. So we just do a quick console log. We'll do our switch layer names. So in our browser, we'll have an array of 3 objects, and now we just have our layer names that are associated with our switches. Now we just need to do the same thing for our other objects. So let's just copy this. We'll paste it a few times. So now we'll have our pot layer names. Then we'll have our door layer names. We'll have our chest layer names, and then our enemy layer names. Now we just need to update our references for our layer name, and so we'll have pots, doors, chest, and then enemies. Now that we have all of our layer names, we just need to iterate through these arrays and then create our various objects. So let's do our door layer names. We'll do for each. We'll do our layer. For each of our layers, we want to call this create doors. Now we'll pass in our map, our layer.name, and then our room ID. So now we'll copy this. We want to do it for all of our various layers. So now we'll do our switch layer names, our pot layer names, our chest layer names, and finally our enemy layer names. Now let's update our methods we're calling, and so we'll do create buttons, create pots, create chests, and then create enemies. Now if we save, we should see now in our browser. So now if we save over in our browser, we should now see a bunch of log lines where we're calling our methods for each of our object layer names with the appropriate room ID. So one quick change we need to make to our code is when we created our tile map for our key, we referenced our string directly instead of going through our asset keys. Anytime we reference one of our assets, we want to make sure we go through this object here so we're using the correct string. So let's copy our asset keys here. We'll add in our bracket so we reference our property. And now we want to get rid of 2 uppercase. And now we'll be referencing our string from our asset keys object. So now for each of our methods we added, we want to create our various tiled objects from our layer data. For this, we'll be doing what we did in our create rooms method. We're going to call a utility function, provided our map and our layer name, and then we'll rely on that utility function to get our base object data. So let's copy this line of code. Let's place that below all of our console log lines in each of our methods. Then we'll start on our create doors method. So for our create doors, we want to call getTiledDoorObjects from map. For this function, we'll pass in our map and our layer name. Next, for create buttons, we'll call our getTiledSwitchObjects from map. For create pots, we'll do our getTiledPotGameObjects from map. Create chest, do getTiledChestGameObjects from map. Finally, for our enemies, we'll do getTiledEnemyObjects from map. As now for each of these, just for the time being, we're just going to log out our valid tiled objects. I'm going to copy this out of code and paste in our other methods. Now if we save, our browser should refresh, and we'll see after we parse each of our layers, we should now have an array of objects that has our various properties that make up that object. So for our doors, we'll have our door properties that we added to our custom class, as well as our key data for our X, Y, our width and height. Take a look at our switches. We should see that we have our texture, our action type. Then for our chest, we should see things like the contents. If it's a boss key chest, its trigger. And then finally for our enemies, we should see like our enemy type here. So now for each of these methods, all we're doing is we're just grabbing our tiled objects based from our layer, similar to what we did for our doors. And then we're going through that properties array, and we're finding all of the properties that should exist on our game object. So example for our door, we're grabbing like our door ID, our target door ID, our direction, our door type, our trap door type. So all of those custom properties we added in our custom class and tiled, we just want to make sure all those properties exist on our objects before we create our custom door object and push it in the array that we're returning. And then we just follow that same pattern for all of the additional objects that we create. So we won't dive deeply into each of these functions, but that's what they do at a high level. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.